I have with me Patrick Maguire, political correspondent for The Times and former political correspondent, I have to say, for the New Statesman, and Gabriel Pogrund, Whitehall editor for The Sunday Times. They're with me today to talk about their new book, Get In, the inside story of Labour under Starmer. So let me ask you about the origins of this book, because you've been working on it, I think, for a very, very long time. Gabriel.
It's the product of a year of reporting, and we had chronicled the downfall of Corbyn's leadership of the party, and that was a sort of post-mortem. We called it Left Out, and this is Get In. It's a story of how Starmer has defied at least recent Labour history and done that thing that so few of his predecessors have done. He's gotten into power, he's done it, and we have sought to explain how that happened.
Paddy, this in many ways reminds me of the Tim Shipman approach to writing big books. In other words, you have huge numbers of sources and hours of tape-recorded conversation. Just tell people listening a little bit about how you actually go about doing something like this.
Yeah, we'd be lying if we said we weren't indebted to Tim Shipman and, of course, before him, Andrew Rawnsley, who wrote the definitive insider accounts of New Labour. And you're right, we spent many, many hours speaking to people, obviously. As working journalists with a focus on the Labour Party, we're in constant communication with people anyway. So over time, often with some people, we spent as many as sort of 20, 30 hours talking to them on slightly different terms than one would have a normal conversation for a column or a piece for the weekend's paper, with a greater degree of candour. If they mentioned any particularly juicy details, we'd ask always if they could give us documentary evidence to prove that, be it a WhatsApp conversation or an email or a policy paper. Some people less forthcoming than others on that matter. But yeah, it's the product of certainly more than 150 people and many hundreds of hours of conversation.
So a huge amount of work. I felt the picture on the front was the wrong picture. I thought it should have been Morgan McSweeney, who appears on every second page all the way through. We talk about Morgan McSweeney a lot in columns and in books. His name appears frequently, but we never talk really directly about him. We all know him. We've spoken to him. So let's just talk a little bit about who Morgan McSweeney is. We know he comes from Cork. We know he's the great fixer. But in terms of his own politics, his eloquence, just gives people listening a sense of Morgan McSweeney. Gabriel, first of all.
So I wouldn't disabuse listeners of the idea that he is at least the joint protagonist of the book, and you might say he is the hero of the book or the person who ought to be on the cover. He's certainly the man to whom Starmer subcontracted a lot of his politics in the early phase of his leadership, and in some ways, it's sort of less of a conventional relationship in terms of a politician hiring an advisor. It's I think it's fair to say it's a partnership, and it was a partnership. Their paths became entwined in 2019, and we actually sort of start with McSweeney's situation which was he was running this very anonymous, actually quite deliberately secretive organisation, Labour Together, whose objective was actually removing itself from Westminster physically, but also intellectually. He had this perception there were a lot of people who are hyperventilating on Newsnight, portending the extinction of the Labour Party, and he was there thinking, well, I don't think it's going to be extinct, and I don't accept that it has to be, but what I'm going to do is think, what do I need to do to make sure that when Corbyn does go, that we're in the right position. We've done the thinking, the polling, the research to make the most of that opportunity.
Labour around. And the book starts with Morgan McSweeney going in to see Jeremy Corbyn, basically to tell him it's all over, and Jeremy not quite realising that was what the message was. And it ends right at the end of the story, well after the election, with Starmer and him back in wordless communication again. Paddy, Morgan McSweeney seems to me to be somebody who is enormously eloquent, very, very powerful in his own politics. And in a sense, if Morgan McSweeney was on television every day, the government would be in a much, much stronger place. Do you feel some sense of frustration that we can't get, as it were, Morgan McSweeney, in his own words, in front of cameras, in front of the rest of the country?
Well, certainly he's very good, and we quote lots of private meetings between, Labour grandees and Morgan McSweeney, at which Morgan McSweeney articulates that sort of politics. And I think you're right in that when Morgan McSweeney speaks about his politics, who the Labour Party is for, who it's against, where it's gone wrong, you get a sense of moral and political clarity that can sometimes be lacking from Keir Starmer. Now, and that is one of the central questions of the book. It's the extent to which their politics are the same, or the extent to which Keir Starmer has said, well, you know how to win. I like nothing more than winning. You sort that out. But it's certainly true. Sort of moral clarity, a sense of, Labour can't be a small c Conservative party that's for the Liberal status quo. And a lot of it is quite bracing, and it's a challenge to the Labour Party's sensibilities.
I can remember talking to Morgan about the grooming gang scandal way, way before Elon Musk put it on the national agenda, and his sense of burning, molten fury about the way that Labour councillors and Labour people had allowed this to happen was really, really interesting. And we talk a lot about blue Labour in the media at the moment. Let's just again tell people what you think Morgan McSweeney would understand by blue Labour, because he's in many respects the quintessential blue Labour kind of guy.
Yeah, I think it's a sort of post-Blairite politics that recognises, and this is another interesting tension, by the way, there are lots of high Blairites in Starmer's number 10 now and his inner circle, but it's a recognition that New Labour got a lot right electorally, but it also got some things wrong, and it lost touch with or didn't fix the problems that are causing alienation and material poverty and a sense of that sense of alienation from mainstream and Labour politics that lots of people in what we once called Labour's heartlands are now experiencing. So it requires a more assertive line or a more robust line, Morgan McSweeney would probably say, on law and order, on immigration, on questions of culture. And those, of course, are things people in the Labour Party can often be squeamish about because they don't want to seem to be giving succour to the right. But I think Morgan McSweeney, throughout this story, thinks it is absolutely essential that the Labour Party is made to feel uncomfortable with itself. And now, obviously, lots of people don't like that, but it's hard to look at the history of this period without thinking it's probably worked.
So to Gabriel, to what extent do you think this whole blue Labour thing is about having a party who knows who it is governing for as well as who it's governing against?
I think who it is governing for is... I think McSweeney has a very clear sense of who the party ought to be for, and it's not the people that it has been for over the last, say, 10 years. There's this amazing...
It's not the metropolitan intelligentsia.
Yeah, and he's almost outraged by the suggestion that it should be. There's this line that we quote in the book where he, speaking to a confidant who, helpfully for us, did have notes of the conversation, and he said, why should Labour be the party of the judges? Why should we be the party of the BBC? And it seems as self-evident as night following day. Of course, Labour represents the judiciary and the BBC. He said, why should we be the party of Gary Lineker earning £1.2 million a year? And he does have this sense that the establishment of which Labour has been part has all too readily forgotten the people who it is supposed to serve.
We will come on to the question of whether Labour in government can be a disruptor from the centre. But let's turn now to Keir Starmer himself, because I have to say I find the book absolutely fascinating, but also very depressing in the sense that it gives an impression of Starmer as a kind of empty vessel, a kind of constant vacancy, somebody who's not really chairing his own meetings when he's running to be leader, and who says very defiantly at one point there's no such thing as Starmerism, and there never will be. There's a danger in these kind of books, because of the sources that you go to, that the main protagonist figure, in this case Starmer himself, comes around as I say, a kind of vacancy, an empty shell.
I think that's certainly true, and I think it's a fair criticism. To that, I would say we approached this in the same way that we approached our Corbyn book, which was, OK, we have our own views and analysis of the Starmer project, but if we had been inundated by people saying the way this project worked is that Keir gave clear direction here and, this was all about Keir, we would have written that down. What was striking about so many of our conversations was not necessarily, some people were disobliging about Keir, but many more people didn't mention him, or if they did, it was incidental. It was, we came up with this plan and eventually Keir said yes, or we did this in spite of Keir, or we all hated Sue.
He signed it off on the 11th hour of conference.
Yes, exactly. Or, we didn't involve Keir because he wasn't particularly interested and he trusted us. There are lots of different ways to slice that essential dynamic. And it's not to say Keir Starmer doesn't have politics. We study at some length the missions, which were an attempt to make the Labour Party authentically Keir Starmer. I mean, we can, whether they're still committed to that is another question. But, there was definitely a time where there was an attempt to reconfigure the politics of Labour around Keir Starmer himself and what he believed. But, yeah, it's certainly true that, with various shades of respect for the man, the impression we have been given from speaking to many people is that the way this project is set up is that the political direction most of the time does not come from Keir Starmer.
Which is, therefore, quite worrying and deflating for an awful lot of people on the left of politics. But let's carry on talking about Keir Starmer, because clearly, in some ways, he does have politics. He wants to become leader of the Labour Party and Prime Minister for reasons, and they're discussed. He does have the mission statements put out. But to what extent do we think the issue has been that for so much of his political career, he was, as it were, taking on the Conservative establishment? In other words, that his politics were defined by who he wasn't. He's not ill-disciplined, sloppy, self-indulgent like Boris Johnson. He's not ideological like Liz Truss. And suddenly you arrive in government and I'm not this, I'm not that, I'm not the next thing, but the question is, what are you, Gabriel?
I think that he was a lot more comfortable talking about what he was against. That's quite right. I mean, we depict a moment after Prime Minister's questions where he emerged and was unburdening himself to his advisors, and he really hated Boris Johnson. He hated the fact that he was sure he just lied to him, and he was outraged and disgusted by that. I suppose, we're not here to do armchair psychoanalysis, but whether he leaned into what he was against because he wasn't that capable of or given to articulating what he was for is certainly a question that the book poses. And I think it is difficult to reconcile how his leadership has zigged and zagged intellectually with the idea that he has a very strong sense of what he definitely wants to do in terms of policy. I mean, for instance, if you look at how he ran in 2020, I mean, naturally it's well-trodden ground that is all now on the cutting room floor. But either he has changed his mind, or I think we've mentioned Tom Baldwin's book. Perhaps he does adopt this sort of barrister-like approach of representing the brief he's given in a given moment.
I think Tom Baldwin would say, all the way through, he sees something that he wants to achieve. He sees a goal, and he just thinks, how do I get to that goal? And he will do anything to get to where he needs to get. Once he's got there, there's another thing to get to. And it's sort of stage by stage by stage, which is kind of the reverse of having a big, vivid, principled vision that you can articulate on television programs or radio shows or where else.
Yeah, and it also maybe partly explains the power and influence Morgan McSweeney and his acolytes have been given at various stages of this project. Because if clearly there is immense respect, save for the odd private disobliging comment between the two men, because they have a compact, they have a contract that has worked for them both, i.e. Keir Starmer is willing to say to Morgan McSweeney, you do this is where I want to go, you're going to get me there. And in Keir Starmer, Morgan McSweeney has a leader who is not, as people have said to us about Ed Miliband, ringing you up at midnight saying, have you seen this essay in the New Statesman or whatever, I've found an errant comma in a press release. He's not an Ed Miliband. He's not a Gordon Brown. And whether that's a sign of self-confidence or a sign of detachment, people draw their own conclusions. But it's a unique way in sort of recent Labour history of working.
Yeah, I'd also say, I mean, we have to live with the critique you've made, which is that these books do depict history through the eyes of advisors and those who happen to be willing to talk, drink with us or and shoot the shit about what happened at Conference 2021. And we were actually mindful of that before the exercise, but we felt we'd written a book in which the character Corbyn had been conspicuous by his absence, and we wanted to be disciplined and not fall foul of that again, or at least I think we did feel with Corbyn it was a fact that he became more Delphic as time went on. He did withdraw into himself towards the end of his leadership. We thought, well, we got to give Keir all credit over here. And I think, for instance, the fact that he doesn't like politics, that doesn't necessarily count against him.
And by not liking politics, we should be clear. What he means by that, he hates the Westminster game. He hates hanging around in the bars and the tea rooms of Westminster, forming factions, forming groups, doing lots of things that people at Westminster take for granted. It's in their blood. It doesn't necessarily mean he hates big policy changes. He hates reforming the NHS, or he hates looking at the benefit system.
No, it's the stuff of politics. It is so much of which is second nature to the Labour Party. And that's another challenge to the Labour Party's sensibility. You know, we all know that there's nothing like the narcissism of small differences in the Labour Party. You know, are you on the old right? Are you a Blairite? Are you a Brownite? You know, even now. Yes, exactly. And the moment he comes in 2015, Keir Starmer is baffled and thinks this is all slightly frivolous and beneath him, probably with some justification given the seriousness of what he'd done previously. But that also sort of isolates him from the people who, after 2021, come into the shadow cabinet, come into his inner circle and take control of the politics of the project. It's a really interesting paradox. Who comes to save him in 2021? Who's in the cabinet now? Well, most of them, if they backed Keir Starmer, they weren't particularly enthusiastic about it. And in the case of Rachel Reeves, Pat McFadden, they didn't endorse him in the first place. So it's a very interesting question of how this has changed. The thing he hated most is the thing that now sustains him.
I'd like to talk about a few other characters right at the top of the tree at the moment, because there's a fascinating series of pages in the book about Angela Rayner, when she is quite seriously thinking of going for the leadership herself after Beergate, when he is in deep, deep trouble. And you quote the Angela Rayner manifesto, which I've never really come across before in that way, about higher taxation,
Scandinavian style
social democracy. And suddenly somebody who is a clear, vivid, familiar kind of politician comes into focus. Now, for an awful long time, perhaps for those reasons, Keir Starmer treated her with great suspicion and iron tongs. But it seems to me now that she is absolutely hooped into place and immovable.
That's quite right. I mean, we do also in the book refer to the many different faces of Angela Rayner, or there's more than one. There's the Rayner who can be quite thin-skinned and who often feels disrespected and slighted.
And was frightened for her own safety, according to your book, for quite a while.
Yeah, I think this has actually been sort of underwritten. I know that MP safety has been is a theme that's been dissected in some detail publicly, but the extent to which she personally has felt that and that has affected her, I'm not sure how much she has discussed it. But there's that Rayner. There's the Rayner of the left. I mean, she has a sort of complicated relationship with the left, not least because I think she felt that they'd betrayed her by running a candidate against her back in 2020. But there's no doubt now, I think that Starmer needs her just as much as she needs him. We saw that during the election with Diane Abbott when she was the diplomat that Starmer couldn't be.
The Harold Wilson comparison's been made very often, not least by Nick Thomas-Simmons, Starmer's friend, who wrote a biography of Harold Wilson. But it seems to me there's a very strong parallel to the extent that Harold Wilson was overseeing a cabinet with some bigger, stronger, more vivid, and in some respects more challenging figures around him. And he was prepared to sort of play at the back of the field and let others score the goals or, gain the applause when they weren't. And you look at this cabinet, and we've talked about Angela Rayner. You've got a story in it about Rachel Reeves and Wes Streeting, almost, but not quite, having a conversation about who is going to go for it next. And you look at how Wes Streeting is behaving at the moment and the risks he is prepared to take and the enemies he is prepared to make to give himself a very, very clear profile. And the same, of course, Rachel Reeves, sturdily carrying on when everybody thinks she's sort of finished for this reason or that reason. We have a cabinet where the leader, the Prime Minister, is surrounded by people who in many respects look bigger than he is.
Yes, and actually that's something, I spoke earlier about Keir Starmer's self-confidence or self-assurance, something he said regularly to Wes Streeting when every newspaper would run the obligatory Wes Streeting is the next leader of the Labour Party or the saviour of the Labour Party and he's better than Keir Starmer at X, Y and Z. Keir Starmer very relaxed, saying, I don't mind tall poppies. Several people from his then Chief of Staff, Sam White, cabinet ministers, and now cabinet ministers who are close to him, said, when Durham police were investigating him, they said, don't say you're going to resign because it will cause, in the word of Nick Thomas-Simmons actually, enormous instability in the shadow cabinet. You will set them off. They will be talking about who's going to be the next leader. And the reaction from Keir Starmer was a sort of phlegmatic shrug saying, well, of course they will.
But it's the right thing to do anyway.
Yes, exactly. And we will put this back in its box afterwards. And I don't mind ambitious and talented people discussing what they want to do.
We've talked about some of his weaknesses. He has a great strength, which is a sort of steely resilience. He just keeps going on when lots of other people would either give up or, throw a tantrum or whatever. And, he's under huge pressure at the moment, not least from Trump and around the world. But I think his I'd be very interested in your views, his superpower is a kind of rubbery resilience.
I think that's right, and I think my mind always falls to Israel on this point, because he had arrows in his back by February 2024 on that topic, and I mean it wasn't just the massed ranks of the extra parliamentary left; it was members of his own cabinet saying, "Yeah, boss, we've got to change tack," and there is a steeliness to him, and sometimes, as we've said, he seems quite withdrawn from events, but that was one thing where he had this quite visceral conviction, and he wasn't for turning. And I think there are times where he does seem capable of dialing down the volume.
He's a hard man,
and it's that dislike of his or disdain for politics can sometimes work in his advantage. We were talking about Angela Rayner's proposed or abortive coup in the wake of Hartlepool earlier. I mean, that evening in Labour HQ was a scene of pure panic. But Keir Starmer wasn't there because after he spoke to Angela Rayner at about 5:30, he said, "Well, I'm not sitting here all night. I'll go home. We can talk when people want to, get a grip." Now, the political thing to do in that scenario would be to have a sleepless night and have crisis talks and be on the phone to the leader of this union or that.
War game it out.
Yeah, actually, in a lot of occasions, Keir Starmer just says, "Well, I'm not going to do the conventional political thing." The conventional political thing to do over Jeremy Corbyn would have been to readmit him and find some sort of fudge. It's that, as you say, that resolve has given him clear political definition in a way, despite his not being political.
So now we're persuading ourselves that he's really interesting. That's good. Let me ask you about a couple of specific stories, because your newspaper's very much plucked out of the book, and perhaps you did, I don't know, the story about his voice coach and breaking lockdown. And a lot of people in politics are right now absolutely going for him, saying this is quite clearly broke lockdown rules and there should be a big investigation. Some people say he should resign over it. What's your own personal views about that story?
So I'm going to lift the veil on the news gathering process for listeners and reveal that Leonie Mellinger, this Shakespearean actress, she appears in a book in a single sentence and has nothing to do with her breaking lockdown. We happened to report on the fact that Starmer had this voice coach, and in their great wisdom, the editors at the Sunday Times suggested that we go speak to her as part of our kind of promotional package for the book. I don't want to put anybody to sleep. The long story short is that she divulged that she had spent time with Starmer in 2020.
And others then jumped on
and
that.
And then others jumped on it. So, I mean, we're wholly blameless in this whole
We
escapade.
actually thought that story would be, we know we're going to cause people in Number 10 won't necessarily like reading the serialisation package, or not all of it, but here's a nice feel-good story about the member of Keir's inner circle that we never heard about. And that was a detail that... not doing ourselves down as journalists, totally passed us by, and we didn't expect this amount of fuss over it.
And right now, do you regard it as a capital offence, what happened then?
Probably not, to be honest with you. Personally, I mean, there are legitimate questions to ask, not least because of how Keir Starmer carried on. There were people in the shadow cabinet who thought he'd been hoisted by his own petard over Beergate. They said, well, you shouldn't have been moralising so extensively about Boris Johnson because everybody will have breached the rules. There are clearly questions to answer, but, I don't think he's going to have to resign as Prime Minister.
There's one other person I want to raise, which is Sue Gray, because the account of Sue Gray's early period in Number 10, as well as just before Labour take power, is absolutely devastating. I don't think I have ever read such a drive-by demolition of somebody's record as your sources gave to you. Do you think that she's been unfairly treated in any way?
Look, I will say, we revealed the fact that Gus O'Donnell, the former Cabinet Secretary, after whom Sue Gray was named Deputy God, having worked alongside him, he told people when she was appointed this isn't the right job for her. She's been this enforcer and fixer. The idea that she should be running government is ridiculous. But there is one thing I'd also say, which is that Starmer, when we talk about him being meticulous, detail-driven, you mentioned this meeting which he wouldn't chair, but where he was very keen that they should be on top of campaign finance commitments. I think for us it remains quite confounding. I'm not sure we'll ever quite get down to the bottom of how it was. that Starmer managed to squander that period. You don't get momentum and good faith back, and I don't think you can just pin the blame on Grey.
It does explain a lot about the first few weeks and months of this Labour government, Paddy. The absolute lack of organisation, coordination, briefings of likely press stories, etc., that was going on inside Number 10. It's a picture almost of total chaos.
Yes, and there is also, on the flip side, the question of, look, as early as January, when we were having conversations for this book, people were telling us that Sue Gray's a disaster. She won't last. We don't want her to last. So, yes, those days were chaotic, but there was an extent to which some people needed them to be totally chaotic. So Sue Gray's position would become untenable. And it was a picture of total chaos, and it was partly, the book can stop with Sue Gray, it can stop with Morgan McSweeney. I think Morgan McSweeney and Keir Starmer bear as much responsibility as Sue Gray. If Sue Gray was unsuitable for that role, that was a conversation that needed to have happened before. Keir Starmer probably shouldn't have appointed her because, as lots of people who knew from the civil service said, great woman, talented woman in many respects, but not an administrator. And why nobody had that conversation sooner reveals something about the way power works and the way these relationship works.
Question for both of you. Will Keir Starmer, with Morgan McSweeney alongside him, lead the Labour Party into the next general election?
I have said before, we specialise in hindsight, not foresight, but this is one matter on which I feel pretty strong in my conviction. The answer is yes.
I would agree. Barring accident, I think the most likely scenario in which Keir Starmer doesn't do that is if he himself decides, I don't want to do it. And I suspect there is no clear alternative. I think Morgan McSweeney probably knows and probably wants it to be Keir Starmer for the next 5 years.